Sandy. Sandy believes in community participation, as you well know. And so she asked us to discuss prostitution at the end of the show. If you've just sat for 3 hours, I'm not sure how long we'll go. But we'll give you kind of a taste of two worlds, the old one and the new one. We just start. I'm, of course, Leo Morgan. I've known Max since more than a decade. And she has worked very hard on some legislation in California. It's been fun to watch her get out there and fight. She's the founder and still president of the Erotic Service Providers Union of San Francisco.
All right.
That's quite a title.
We also hoped to invite, or have here, Chief Mark Mew of the Anchorage Police Department, or someone he selected from his force, so that we could learn more about the enforcement philosophy here in Anchorage and perhaps get some current statistics. Mew's spokesman, Lieutenant David Parker, responded that the chief had other plans. He also added that the folks at the APD usually encounter human trafficking issues in dealing with prostitution in Anchorage and see the physical and emotional toll it takes on prostitute victims. And when I suggested many in the trade did not see themselves as victims, Lieutenant Parker assured me everyone in prostitution was a victim. And maybe that's a good basis for a little discussion tonight. A few historical facts to set things up. At the beginning of the Alaska-Yukon gold rush, and most of them in our area in the far north, men usually outnumbered women about 10 to 1. The cost of living at that period was $6 a day. The most a woman could make legitimately was $5. Do the math. A number of our women, we believe, were amateurs, not professional prostitutes. That, well, we know some of them came up with a husband, a father, a brother, and that person couldn't make it, stayed, died, whatever, and the woman was left on her own. And I think some of them had the same thought I did when I got here from New England. Mother is 5,000 miles away and she'll never find out. I'll get in and get out and see what happens. The Fairbanks line is particularly interesting because it was started by Episcopal preacher Archdeacon Stuck. He had seen the miners coming into camp, and what prostitutes were there had pimps, and the miners were being rolled and murdered and treated badly, and he had been in Texas cattle towns where there was no law, and he thought, So he laid out the red light district for Anchorage. Imagine an Episcopal priest doing that. He wrote the ground rules, and he got land that the prostitutes were allowed to purchase at very reasonable prices. So perhaps for the very first time a girl could work safely without a pimp. And it was a remarkable era in Alaska. I think we started something. Tell us how the world's oldest profession stands today and why you are an activist.
Well, thank you, Leo. I think that the play and Leo's work deserves a special round of applause. I'm a big Leo Morgan fan, and I so appreciate having the history documented in an impartial way that we can all have access to it, and to see it portrayed in this play, this musical, was just an overwhelming, beautiful experience for us that got to come and watch it on opening night, and I hope that it was for you as well. I always want to say a special hello to anybody in the room who may have worked in the sex industry, or maybe somebody who is related to somebody who worked in the sex industry. I I think that at the turn of the century, we saw the criminalization of prostitution that resulted in the actual people involved in the sex industry not be able to speak out and admit that they were in fact in the sex industry. So I always want to say a special hello to anybody who may have worked as a stripper or in some capacity as a sex worker, as we say these days. So yeah, I founded the Erotic Service Providers Union for people who earn a living with their erotic labor, people who are prostitutes in any capacity, street-based workers, home-based workers, agency workers, strippers, adult film actors, pornography, webcamming, as you may or may not know, is the fastest growing part of the sex industry today. And there's a lot of crossover for people. So that's kind of the group that we work on organizing, and we work on actually repealing the criminalization of prostitution laws, because those laws violate our First Amendment right to free speech, to be able, as Lael said, in the city of Anchorage, it's actually a criminal misdemeanor offense to say that you are practicing prostitution here. So as a result of that kind of situation, you have people who can't gain access to rights that you have, the right to have equal protection under the law, for example. So as we saw in the play here, our very unique situation at the turn of the century, where women were actually able to own businesses, which was phenomenal back then for women who didn't even have the right to vote. So at the time of this play that takes place, and a lot of the documentation that Lael does, women did not have the right to own property. So they had to have men in their lives in order to gain access to the property to be able to conduct business. And unfortunately, a lot of the anti-prostitution laws were passed prior to women having the right to vote. So since women were the majority that make up the people in the sex industry, they didn't have access to say, wait a minute, don't criminalize my workspace. And that's generally how the abatement of the Red Light District Act started, is it criminalized the workers' space where the workers actually worked. And a lot of those spaces were owned by men because men could own property, and it was more difficult for women to own property. So, 100 years later, a lot of those old draconian, archaic laws are still on the books, but they have new forms that they take.
I should tell you that in writing the book, which took me researching about 30 years, I interviewed about 200 men who knew women on the line, particularly in Fairbanks, because Fairbanks line lasted through World War II. And every one of them I interviewed in Alaska had been the paper boy. They'd fixed the plumbing, they'd done the roof. But they never had anything physically to do with the ladies of the evening. And this is like 200. Finally, I go to a pioneer convention in Dawson. And, I'm getting the same old, except for one guy who said, oh, yeah, every second Thursday. But I'm thinking, with that kind of approach, those girls could have made no money at all, and we know they did. So maybe, you don't know who has worked in the trade in our audience or anywhere today, because it's something you can't talk about. I think that probably we're more customers than we know about too.
Absolutely.
I looked at there's a wonderful webpage that has all the state laws for all the states on prostitution, and it's a misdemeanor here, right, if you're picked up as a prostitute. In some states it's a felony. If it's a felony, you can't vote, you can't fly, you can't do a lot of things, which is pretty steep. So I was feeling pretty good about Alaska, at least for a misdemeanor, right? But if you run a house in Alaska, it's a felony if you're prosecuted for being a madam. Now, and heaven forbid anyone would even think of it, if you were going to go to work as a lady of the evening, where would you rather work? All by yourself out there? Looking for customers, or in a well-organized house where you've got a madam who knows how to protect you. I think it's very strange that that should carry one whopping big penalty.
Right, so one of the big issues today in the industry is we have the internet. So anybody can go on the internet and put up her ad or his ad and say that, you know, you're providing a sensuous massage or you're providing an alcohol escort service without any training. So as a result of that, we're seeing people making themselves available in a way that they don't have any sort of training about how to entertain people, how to provide safe sex services. And so those are some of the issues that we face today. And those are some of the issues why it's one of the ways criminalizing people who train other people to do work in the sex industry is primarily a felony across the United States. And in the Erotic Service Providers Union, what we talk about when we talk about the bosses is we talk about people who are being paid to provide support staff services in some capacity. Because generally it's the actual worker, the prostitute or the exotic dancer, who receives the money from the customer directly and then in turn disperses the money. So what we talk about is that the worker always has complete control over their production of their own labor. And then it's up to them to decide, yeah, you know, it's helpful if you answer the phone, or, you know, if I have a place we can share, you know, apartments together, or, you know, you drive me and be my security on my out-call, those kinds of things. And so all those are negotiated services, but those are all criminal negotiations. You can't negotiate for your own labor in your own work condition, either as a worker or as somebody who works in a support staff capacity. And so that's some of the big differences. When you see the lives that are depicted 100 years ago, it's almost like we were actually better off back then than we are now.
In some ways you were.
Yeah.
Because if you had, like Fairbanks had a line, everybody in town knew where it was, everybody knew what the rules were. It was right next to City Hall. There, if you read the papers for that period, murders or crimes against prostitutes are virtually nil, because it's really controlled. Of course, in the Arctic, we have an advantage too. Prostitutes knew far more about control of sexually spread diseases and birth control than most respectable women, because the Comstock Act passed around the turn of the century forbid mailing birth control information in the mails, and most doctors wouldn't discuss that with a decent woman. So the gals had a better chance than most wives, if their husbands were scooting around, of staying safe. And then in Alaska, like Dawson and Fairbanks, nobody came in all winter long, except maybe an occasional dog mushing. And they all had medical inspections once a week. And so you don't hear any horror tales of bad diseases and things like that. How does health control, when AIDS came in and we heard about AIDS, prostitutes were going to spread AIDS all over the place, right?
Right.
I haven't heard of a single case.
That's a really controversial issue. We just had the International AIDS Conference in Washington, D.C. It was the first time in 10 years that international conference was held in the United States. And one of the big controversies about it is that the United States wouldn't allow in people who work as prostitutes. So if you come to the border of the U.S. and you say, oh yeah, I work as a prostitute, they'll say, oh no, you can't come in. And so a bunch of the sex workers from India who wanted to come over and participate in the International AIDS Conference and be able to affect the international AIDS policy were not able to come. So that was a big disappointment to the sex industry, and there was a little bit of protest about that. There's a bunch of really terrible U.S. policies around disbursement of HIV treatment and prophylactics, condoms essentially. And really bad policy says that if the U.S. is giving money to a nonprofit organization internationally to disperse HIV treatment and prevention, that international group has to swear off prostitution. They have to actually take an oath that says, you cannot talk about prostitution as a right. You just can't even talk about it. So that's a pretty big challenge for people who are offering health care to be able to help, say a third world country, sex worker who's doing it on an amateur or part-time basis to, make ends meet, to be able to say, I'm going to give you this condom, but I'm not going to really tell you how to negotiate the use of it with your customer, because I will lose my funding and you will lose your condoms, and then we won't be able to provide treatment. So that's something that we have organized heavily around to lobby our state senators and state U.S. representatives to say, when this act comes up for reauthorization in 2013, please remove the anti-prostitution oath from it.
It occurs to me that HIV doesn't usually travel through PTA meetings, and maybe that's a good way to go. We have a pretty intelligent audience here, and we appreciate you staying. And I'm wondering if anybody has any ideas, any questions. Yes.
Do you know how much the girls made during the conduct? Did many of them come away with some money? And how were the children? What happened to the children of the prostitutes?
There's a wonderful book called No Step Backwards, written on a gal who researched the line in Helena about the same time we were working Alaska. And all the bank accounts had survived the list of how much the gals made. And it was astonishing how much they made and how many just took the money and retired to regular jobs. If a gal paid attention, she could do darn well. Most of the gals that I've documented, if they had children, like Chicago Joe and Helena, or a number of people around Alaska too, Klondike Kate perhaps, had children and they left them with families. They paid quite well to bring these children outside their area. But if you look at the census, you'll find that in some of those houses there are children. And some of them fared not so well, I would assume. We don't really know. It's pretty hard to, since prostitutes weren't into documenting what they were doing even back then, and a lot of them couldn't write, it's pretty hard to track them. But if a gal knew what she was doing, and she got in the right spot, like the line in Fairbanks or the one in Helena, which was very well controlled, and in favor of the girls doing what they wanted to. In fact, there wasn't a single arrest for prostitution in Helena for the first 20 years, I think.
Well, it makes me think of one of the stories in your book about Georgia Lee, who dies in 1954, and she leaves $100,000. In 1954, that was a lot of money. She leaves that to her relatives. So there's two things to share about that. One is that under the criminalization of the pimping and pandering laws, they definitely read that anybody who earns a living from the prostitute's earnings in part or in whole is guilty of pimping, for example, in the state of California. So that would cover all my children, any prostitutes' children who have been supported. Landlords who receive any money from prostitutes would be covered under that. If you supported your parents in their elderly years, the parents would be considered pimps as well. So that's some of the problems with those kinds of laws around criminalizing the economy of prostitutes, is they were trying to make it so that any of the relationships that the prostitutes had would be criminal. And that, that's just not really helpful. Recently, there's been a couple of really great pieces of research, and they're depicted in a couple books. One is called Freakonomics, and the latest one is called Super Freakonomics. And it compares the earnings of prostitutes at the turn of the century as compared to now. And there's definitely a huge decline in earning power, but that's reflected in our larger culture, where we've seen Americans over the last 30 years have a big decline in their earning power, even though, your production rate is up there, but America's earning power has flatlined for the last 30 years, and that's true in the sex industry as well.
Yeah.
Question, how are you lobbying? I mean, with the Tea Party, it seems like it's like pushing a boulder uphill.
It is pushing a boulder uphill. But what we've done in 2008, we did a ballot measure in San Francisco to decriminalize prostitution, and we got 41% of the vote. And but we've got a big history in San Francisco with a long history of activists there. We have Margot St. James, and we have the Exotic Dancers Alliance, because there's a lot of exploitation that goes on in the dance clubs where dancers are forced to pay every day to work. So, you know, that's all highly illegal, but they get away with it under the guise that they're independent contractors and not employees. So there's some big debates about that. And a lot of it is that in San Francisco, we participate in political clubs. You know, we all belong to local political clubs. So you have the opportunity for candidates who are running for even small positions in the, the Democratic County Central Committee or the Libertarian Party, people who are running for school board. You get an opportunity to question those people about what do they know about the sex industry, and where is their level of support for us. And so it's kind of a long view, and then it's about addressing certain ballot measures that support us or further criminalize people.
So you're working at a state level now?
Yes.
Yes. Scarlett?
Why do you think that some areas of the sex trade, and I'm mostly talking about phone sex or BDSM, don't carry the same, I mean, there's BDSM clubs everywhere, including in Anchorage. Oh, bondage, domination, submission.
Okay.
Yeah. They have open conventions. Why do you think that there's that difference between one part of the sex trade and another?
Well, there is a difference in that some people who perform, sadomasochist or dominant and bondage type of services are not touching people in a sexual way, and that touching for money is what constitutes prostitution. So sometimes people are. But it's just not as visible and it's not as enforceable. I mean, could you just really see a police officer dressing up as a masochist and sneaking his way, into a prostitution sting operation that targets all the, professional dominants? I mean, it happened in San Francisco once, and it was when the dominant pulled out the condom that she was arrested. And that sent a shockwave through the BDSM community there in San Francisco, because we had been putting on legal self-defense workshops for quite a while, and that group always thought, oh, we don't need to bother with that, Maxine, we're above that. And then they got in trouble.
Always claim there's no sex involved, it's just...
Right, and then when you pull out the condom is often used as evidence in cases of prostitution. And that's really one of our main safety devices on our job, and it's criminalized as evidence. So here you often have public health departments who are giving away condoms, trying to encourage safe sex, and then you have the police department setting up anti-prostitution sting operations and confiscating those condoms and using them as evidence of harm.
Rachel, you had a question.
Yeah, one of the reasons that people think that prostitutes are always victims is they're thinking of pimps and relationships with pimps, and I wondered if you could comment on just the difference between a pimp relationship and a madam, or and so
Well, men and women's relationships are always the dominant type of relationships in prostitution, and men being the dominant feature in our culture, gender-wise, economically, physically. So, usually what it comes down to are domestic violence relationships. Relationships where workers are being ripped off and don't have access to equal protection under the law, and that is really the issue, is that there's a dependent relationship there, either economically, sexually, or emotionally, and so when there's even the most minute kind of violence, then you're talking about coercion. But if you don't have access to equal protection, you can't go to law enforcement. You can't call 911. You don't want to go to a shelter and say, yeah, I need shelter, I'm in a bad situation right now, but I gotta go, stand on my street corner and make some money and I'll be back. There's just not a lot of support for that in the American society. There is a lot of support for that in Canada. I toured a bunch of actual shelters in Canada a couple years ago that were specifically built for primarily street-based workers who also had drug addictions, who needed shelter, who needed decent housing. And so what they would experience there is the workers would be able to go and work and come back to the shelter and receive whatever additional kinds of services or treatment that they needed. But what would happen is they would kind of fall off the map. They get involved with somebody, start to, have a relationship. Well, if your relationship knows that you're not going to go to the police and report that you're being a victim of violence, you're being beaten, you're being extorted, you're being ripped off. If you have children, you often see children, even in non-prostitute relationships, you see children used as pawns and the women being threatened, the custody always being threatened. And so it's just compounded when there's criminalization of prostitution. So as long as there is that force into the underground, there's no transparency about what is really the context of the relationships that are occurring here, and then where are the points of departure, and where are the points that the community can come in and help.
We haven't exactly made progress in this particular department. I was amazed to learn in Montana, way into statehood, wives had no protection from their husbands if there was rape or if he beat them. On the other hand, a prostitute who had an unruly customer could report him to the police and get him sent up as long as she wasn't married to him. So we've kind of gone backwards for the prostitutes on that. Wives, however, have a better chance if they can work it out. Yes?
I have two questions. One is, I'm a pimp. Would the new law that you're hoping to accomplish protect a pimp, or are we talking about strictly protecting the prostitute?
We talk about industrial organizing, so we want to bring protection to all the people involved in prostitution. We want people who answer phones, people who provide housing, people who provide janitor services, like in the strip clubs, DJs. We want everybody to have equal protection. And we think that the negotiation for whoever is providing support staff services can be negotiated with some basic contracts that have equal protection written in it. So you have to have some non-discrimination legislation that you can't discriminate against somebody. And that really what you want to do is you want to make sure that you don't, like for example, the legalization brothels in Nevada, that totally legalizes the, we call it the Walmart brothel. And we don't want the Walmart brothel model because all those models there only legalize the owners of the houses. The workers there have no rights. So we want to make sure that any kind of legal scheme that we come up with, make sure that the worker has primarily control over her or his, over their production, the means of their production, and their own money, and that they get to say who they get distribute it to and for what for. And that distribution has to be recognized as a legal negotiated distribution that can be honored.
The other question is, in Germany, in Hamburg, you have legalized prostitution. And there's a long standard of information from that, of the safety that occurs for the public because of the checks. And also they get the physical checks, and they have to be checked every year, several times a year. Do you use any of that information, Europe, to use to build your case for reason to pass the law? Is there anything that's good from that you can utilize? In other words, where it's already being used as a legalized process?
So a couple years ago, I got to go to the World Social Forum in Belém.
Yes.
The World Social Forum is a really big, it's kind of like the social workers and social activists big, huge forum. So there were, I can't remember now, 200,000 people there. It was huge. And so we got to meet the Germans, and Verde is the name of the union that recognizes prostitution as a unionizable industry. And the problem with Verde is they only have one prostitute who's a member of their union, and they're a huge union. They're a public sector union. They're the biggest public sector union in Germany. And so we were asking, well, why do you only have one prostitute who is, you know, wanting to be signed up and wants to be unionized? And, you know, the answer was that because she has to register. So this goes back to kind of the anti-discrimination legislation where you can be registered, you can be recognized as a sex worker, but there's nothing that says that you're going to be provided with equal protection under the law. So there's no benefit into being registered. There's no benefit for workers to come forward and to be organized because it's like, well, what are you gonna give? What do you got? Well, what you have is you have to have some, equal protection of the law, where you can't be discriminated against in housing, in education, in employment. If you have 10 years where you worked as a stripper and then you want to go apply for a PhD program, and they say, well, what have you been doing for 10 years? And how are you going to pay for this PhD? And you say, well, I'm going to strip my way through PhD school. And they're going to say, we don't want you. And so we know tons of workers who've been discriminated against in housing, who've, been the ones to say, I work as a stripper and, I make X amount of dollars a month, and we know landlords who say, no, we don't want you, your kind here, living in our apartment building. So those are the big issues. You can have legalization all you want, you can have decriminalization all you want, but without that legal protection, that, equal, access to being protected, so you can go to the police and you can make a report that you were a victim of crime and not have it be printed in the newspaper. Oh, you just outed somebody who was a victim of rape and she works at the strip club, and now all her neighbors know, and the husband, the ex-husband knows and is going to challenge her for custody of the kids now. So you have to have some kind of anti-discrimination protection to take it a little bit farther, to really give it so that workers have some means, because we've been criminalized for 100 years. That's 100 years of accumulative negative stigma.
Yes.
I am a union representative in the state here. And I wonder, what do you guys do in Alaska for organization and probably more importantly, education information?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what goes on in the primary issue amongst workers is to be able to stay safe from the police. The police are probably the biggest threat. And so information about the police and the police bus. And then, of course, the next would be sharing information about violent customers.
Well, now, I guess what I'm getting at is what is happening in Alaska specifically to further the cause towards making this a more acceptable occupation than it just being. I mean, the comments by the police lieutenant. For one thing, they only see, they never hear from sex workers unless they call the police, somebody calls the police. So if somebody's, or if somebody's working and they have a fine business, and they're just looking forward to retirement, well, nobody calls the police and says everything's going great.
Right.
So it's I don't know of any organization, or I guess more importantly, education for the people, because in order for people to vote and say, yeah, we want to stop, messing with this yet another victimless crime.
One reason that Maxine agreed to come here tonight, and maybe a little personal peril, and we do appreciate it. She's been working hard in California, which is where she's living, but we could use something like that here.
Yeah, I could see a group of interested citizens, for example, coming together and working on some issues to move towards repealing the criminalization of prostitution laws, so that you can get actual workers be able to speak out on their own behalf without the threat of being arrested for prostitution or being discriminated against.
So there's not a chapter of an organization that you belong to?
Not yet.
Well, the Libertarian Party is growing in health up here, and they specifically address, the folly of victimless crimes. Do you guys at all align yourselves with that?
Yeah, when we did Prop K in San Francisco, they were the first political party to endorse
Oh,
Prop
yeah.
K. Absolutely. Yeah, and I've spoken at a lot of libertarian conventions, actually. So I know a bunch of libertarians. They're great.
I don't know enough to know if you already spoke to this, but I don't even know, is it illegal for somebody to pay for a prostitute or just to receive money?
Yeah, all parties are all criminalized on all ends, including people's, children, their roommates, their domestic partners are criminalized under the pimping statutes, landlords, everybody.
You almost never hear though about people being arrested for purchasing services.
That's why I really hope to get someone from the police department here to find out what their philosophy is
Well,
with the laws they've got. They say to me, well, we have to, we're stuck with the laws, we don't make them, we just enforce them, is what Lieutenant Parker said to me. But I'm wondering, as you say, you don't see much.
No, they're doing anti-prostitution sting operations on the customers, where they're specifically entrapping the customers. Entrapment is legal. And so, yeah, they entrap the customers all the time here.
They do sweeps up here like that, they do stand
All the time,
operations here.
yeah. Yeah, and they do it under the guise of rescuing victims. It's like, well, how can you be rescuing victims when you're arresting people? How does that work?
And when you take a stance against this, who are the prime opponents to decriminalization? Is it religious organizations?
Yeah, it's the extreme, there's two groups working here, because they're the same groups that criminalized prostitution 100 years ago, that started in with the criminalization with prostitution laws and the criminalization of our workspaces and the Red Light Abatement Act of 1910. It's the same people. And those two people are, it was the women's suffrage groups that started in with the criminalization of prostitution, because remember, they wanted prohibition on prostitution, on alcohol, right? And they were struggling for the right to vote. So they got the prohibition on alcohol at the federal level, but they didn't get it at the federal level, prostitution at the federal level. So they went after it at the state level. And the reason why state legislatures agreed to criminalize prostitution at the state level is because they knew that this group of rich, white, and entitled Christian women who were trying to lobby for women's rights, they were at the forefront of the women's rights movement back at the turn of the century, were going to get the right to vote, and they were afraid of them. So that's why they started to, and they were successful in criminalizing prostitution, before prostitutes even had the right to vote, and they started to, get the prohibition on alcohol. So it's still those same, two groups today, though those two factions have kind of split off from each other. So you have the extreme left-wing radical feminist groups, who hate sex with men, who, think all sex with men is bad, and, especially women who do it for money, that is the core of all evil. And so they're now partnering with all the extreme, right-wing religious women who are being backed by the big oil. That's who's behind the criminalization today. When we go to do the decriminalization stuff, those are the people that show up to oppose us.
I also invited Jerry Prevost to come and talk. And actually got further with him than I did with the police chief. He was busy this month, but he said, try me later. So we will.
Who is that? Excuse me, who is
Yeah.
He's a Baptist minister.
He's a what?
Tax.
I'm sorry, I don't know who that person is you're talking about.
He's pretty famous up here. He's the leading Baptist. They have a huge campus up, and they're pretty influential.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
Whenever you have vices that are criminalized, drugs, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, you've got a corrupt police force. And they're going to arbitrarily decide who gets arrested and how. And while they're busy doing that, in the case of the serial killer, like you have here in Anchorage, they refused to, it took a long time to bring that guy to justice because the police have other priorities. Whenever those vices are criminalized, it's easier to go and, do that anti-prostitution sting and, pretend like you're a customer and sit with that pretty girl and arrest her for prostitution than to really go after the real bad guys, right? And that's the issue. When you have those dual mandates to provide, protection and safety and arrest people for vices, what are the police going to do? They're going to arrest the vices. It's
It
easier.
wasn't a warrant from Anchorage that arrested our serial killer, was it?
No, it was a warrant from a Fairbanks prosecutor who arrested and took out that serial killer because the local Anchorage Police Department and the local Anchorage District Attorney didn't want to do it. They didn't want to put their careers on the line to pursue somebody who had put himself and was viewed by the larger community as a respectable man of the community. Even though there were women who he had raped and they were prostitutes, they were working prostitutes. One of them he raped, he abducted her, took her down to the peninsula, and she got away from him. She came back to Anchorage here and went to the police and said, yes, this guy raped me, yes, I work as a prostitute, and they didn't want to pursue the case because of her credibility issue, and that's the problem with the criminalization of prostitution, and it's the problem with not having equal protection as a result of the criminalization, and of the 100 years of stigma. You have to have some anti-discrimination legislation to bring, just to be able to bring that class of people up to where the rest of everybody is.
My dad owned a brothel. So I grew up having breakfast with the girls, and they were wonderful. And we had lots of customers that were very high politically. I mean, I never thought there was anything wrong until I was full grown. And then I'd hear people talk about, well, how horrible. And it's like, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was business. It wasn't love, it was business. But it was delightful. We could say that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to make this offer. At Providence, we do free mammography twice a year in the spring and fall. And about a month prior, I get all the strip clubs in town to talk to the bartenders and the cocktail waitresses. So if I give you that information, it'd be great if you could get it out to the girls, because that's an audience that probably needs mammography.
Yeah.
And so if you get that information on, that would be great.
So much appreciated. Thank you. Yes, we are all older.
I'm sorry, on the other hand, I know we've kept you a long time, and it's hard to sit after a long show, but yes.
Well, okay. I don't even know how to ask this question, but all right, my brother was and he frequents prostitutes. He's very open about that he does. So, fine. But my brother is gross. He is. I mean, he just is. But he pays for sex and he gets sex and he's happy. But I've always wondered, what's it like for her? So can you just speak to that?
Right. So, we're educators on good hygiene. And so sometimes the way that culturally people are, taught to view certain people in our culture as undesirable. And so, really, there's something desirable about every single person. And so, as an erotic service provider, you want to find that. And you want to help, bring some of that to light for that person. And, I think it's just great that your brother is out about it. And, one of the things that we're working on is bringing a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit against the state of California for enforcing those anti-prostitution laws because they're unconstitutional. And we are always looking for, the male customers who can be out and to be able to say, yeah, I, pay for services and it's great, and, my service providers are, I met a fellow here who had been seeing the same gal for 13 years. So some of us, when we've been around for a long time, we have long-term relationships with each other and long-term erotic relationships, and it's a great thing. And one of the guys in our lawsuit, who's our plaintiff, our customer plaintiff in our lawsuit, he is disabled. He's a 27-year-old fellow. He's well-educated, but he understands that part of the societal culture is to telling him that he's not desirable. The things that he wants sexually are not desirable. So we want to be really careful and gentle with each other in how we learn to make some new frontier and be some new pioneers trying to repeal these laws, because when we are able to provide services, it makes the whole community a much better place to be in.
What a wonderful attitude about that there's something good, something desirable. Why don't, I so everybody had that.
Well, I'll be
Yes.
happy to teach it to you. Because it's true, right? Right.
I think I'll just wind up with about 2 more questions. We'll be here afterwards if anybody wants to talk to us. Yes.
I have this vision of growing up of the pimp who's on the corner, standing on the corner, who is the threat to the prostitute and is beating the crap out of her.
Right.
And I'd like you to address why that I shouldn't be concerned for that.
I think you should be concerned about that.
Tell me about that.
I think
for
you should be concerned anytime you see anybody being beaten, coerced, forced to take drugs. I mean, anytime we have a member of our community who is unsafe, the whole community is unsafe, right? We have, in labor organizing, what's the saying? If one person is being injured, everybody is going to be injured.
But are we not helping, by passing that law, actually doing some protection for that type of pimp?
But those laws are not working.
So how do you handle that? How do you protect the prostitute? I don't have a problem with the sex worker, the prostitute. I have a problem with the scariness of what goes on to that prostitute on the organization running that operation.
It might help to take the felony penalty away from women who are going to run a decent house, because those gals who end up with pimps,
Yeah, they're limited.
Why do you have a pimp?
They don't have. Well,
What's
a
the
lot
purpose
of
of a
those relationships are domestic relationships. They're domestic economic relationships, right?
I mean, you must keep count of the number of wives who have been stalked, beaten, and murdered. I just came from rural Maine, and I got to tell you, we've had 5 in 4 months, all marriages, which were not made in heaven. There's a crossover between the pimp relationship and what you're seeing on
Could the
that.
pimp relationship be illegal? Could you, in other words, promote the program that you want, protection you want, but eliminate the pimp?
So once again, when you're looking at the legal definition, what you're talking about the cultural definition.
Oh, okay.
So there's a difference between like the cultural definition that you're seeing, that we've all been taught to see, right? Because the only way we learn about this issue is through the media,
Right.
who has an economic interest in showing some very salacious stuff. Like you said, nobody is doing any reporting on how many men and women got to be sexually satisfied today, right? I mean, that is not big news. So the legal definition is the problem, and the legal definition has to change. You have to make legal and recognize the negotiation contract between the worker and the worker's support staff. And that's one of the cultural differences from being inside the industry and how we view ourselves and how society views us. And because our speech is criminalized, you're not going to see people come forward and say, oh, I have the best work situation. It's so worth it, to pay somebody to answer my phones for me. It's so worth it to have somebody run my ads for me, or to, answer that phone, because I have a 2-year-old at home and I could not answer that phone and make those appointments because that kid's going to be screaming his head off in the background and scare away all my customers. So there's just some big differences that we're talking about here. And what you want to do is you want to enforce the laws that are already on the books. There's already laws against rape, robbery, theft, coercion, extortion, battery, right? There's already those laws are there. So that's when I'm talking about gaining access to equal protection, right? You have to gain access to equal protection. Like we saw in the play here, the lead character, she could be called a pimp, right? But yet she's being strong-armed by her former domestic relationship, right? That's really was the problem here in this play, in this particular story, It was the domestic relationship and it was the economic relationship. And because she didn't really have any rights as a woman to own a business, you know, to run her own prostitution business, right? She didn't have any rights. There was nobody that was going to help her, especially up here in Alaska. What are you going to do? Nothing. There's nobody to go to.
Well, we did have protection here, but she came from New Orleans, and at that particular period, it was kind of open.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if a prostitute is beaten silly by a pimp, are the police really going to spend time when they're out, you know, with a baseball bat, killing dangerous people out on the Seward Island? Where are the priorities here? And sometimes, when a gal says she's a prostitute and she's been attacked, it's not taken quite as seriously as if she was.
It doesn't matter who attacks who. Somebody has to be held to justice for it. But if you don't have access to justice, what good are the laws then?
We'll do one more question if anybody has one, and if not, I will officially wrap this up, but we'll be around for a little bit. Anybody else? One final? Well, I thank you for being a very